Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. For everyone who's here already in attendance, thank you for showing up, and thank you to the AHA for promoting the panel as not officially a part of the conference, but as a tangential part of the conference. This panel was originally part of a multi-session workshop that I put together on masculinity in historical practice and subject. The other panel, unfortunately, couldn't continue after the cancellation of the in-person AHA meeting, but I'm hoping that our other 4 panelists from that panel are going to be in attendance as well, and will share some insight with us during the Q&A session and discussion at the end. So this panel is comprised of 3 excellent papers on masculinity in the sciences and professions of the late 19th and early 20th century. To tell you just a little bit about myself, I should introduce myself. I'm Miriam Mora. I put together these panels because I'm currently finishing up a book project on Jewish masculinity in America in the 20th century. And I think masculinity in general, there's a lot of really exciting work coming out, examining a lot of different subjects in different periods from unique and interesting perspectives to do with masculinity, manhood, and the interactions between men and women from new kind of adventurous perspectives. So that was the motivation for getting this started. So kind of a span of what we're going to be hearing about today. Daniela Barberis examines the work of a French neurologist in masculinizing the diagnosis of hysteria. Ellen Abrams and Nicole Hudgins both explore mathematics and photography, respectively, as masculine practices and professions. A note on the format of today's panel: I'm going to introduce each panelist before they speak, and we should have ample time at the end for questions and discussion. I'm going to have the audience muted for the duration of these presentations and ask that those who have questions go ahead and put them in the Zoom chat to me, or you can, if you can't find me for some reason, you can also put it into the group chat to everybody. And what I'm going to do is pull out those questions and kind of collate and organize them and present them to get the discussion going at the end. Once I've presented those questions, I'm also going to give you the ability to unmute yourselves. So if you want to follow up on your own question or ask a question once I'm done with the prepared ones that I have, then you will be welcome to do that. We'll have people digitally or visibly raising their hands. Either one should work. Excuse me. So to begin, our first paper is by Ellen Abrams, who's a postdoctoral fellow in the Humanities Scholars Program at Cornell University. She's currently working on a book about the cultural history of mathematics in the United States. Her paper is titled American Masculinities and Modern Mathematics. Take it away, Ellen.
Great, thank you, Miriam, and also Nicole and Daniela for all of the work putting this together. And thank you for everyone who's here. Let me start with this screen share. Hopefully everyone sees the title page. All right, doing good so far. All right. So I'm, again, very glad to be here today. I'd like to start by introducing you to a mathematician named Volson Wood, who is, oh, now I'm having my own screen problems. One moment, sorry. I just need to figure out how to change the slide. I did this yesterday and it was a little bit, okay. So I'll introduce you quickly to Volson Wood through his biographies that were published in the late 19th century in the American Mathematical Monthly. By marshaling a variety of cultural tropes tied to self-making, rural identity, and manhood, biographies in the monthly offered a particular image of American mathematics at a time when what it meant to be an American mathematician had yet to be defined. Volson Wood, for example, was profiled twice in the journal, first in 1895 while he was working as a professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology, and again after his death in 1897. According to Wood's obituary, which was quoted in the monthly, his solid and robust figure played a part in his, quote, influence on young men. The youth who came in contact with him could not help feeling that he stood before a real man, a man strong and sound mentally and physically. So in general, the monthly was founded and began publishing biographies like Wood's at a time of great change for the American mathematics community. Quote unquote, new forms of mathematics from across the Atlantic were starting to take root in the United States. Professional journals were arriving regularly. And notably more than ever, the pages of American print were filled with personal narratives. So while some of these stories were pretty bizarre and entertaining, they also communicated social patterns and norms to a growing middle class of Americans who began to rely less on traditional conventions of status and respectability, and instead glean standards of success from biographies, advertisements, and news articles. The printed word helped bring new conceptions of selfhood and manhood into being. So my goal today is to show overall that an analysis of gender, specifically in monthly biographies, offers an important lens to understand the late 19th century transitions in American mathematics. While the formation of professional societies and journals offered new forms and opportunities for self-fashioning, seemingly foreign forms of mathematics required new ways of negotiating what it meant to be an American mathematician. Examining the role of gender during a community's transition to abstraction, especially in the United States, I argue provides a new way of understanding the broader historical relationship between gender and mathematics. In the case of monthly biographies, appeals to different types of masculinities suggest fissures in the kind of unified image of the manly mathematician when physical prowess was no longer an assumed feature of scholarly achievement. Although written for a variety of purposes and across contexts, the subjects of most scientific biographies, and therefore of most historical metabiographies, have been well-known scholars. The biographies I'm working with here, however, are remarkable for their presentation of seemingly unremarkable mathematicians. Most of the scholars featured in the monthly were teachers, writers, enthusiasts, all sorts of different kinds of people who identified as mathematicians, but were widely unknown beyond these local biographies and remain absent from most of the histories we tell of American mathematics. It wasn't really until the early 20th century that the category mathematician started to kind of constrict and be confined to professional researchers, specifically those researching abstract mathematics. And most histories of American mathematics have tended to focus mostly on those prominent scholars, both before and after that category was narrowing. But kind of my goal here is to cast a broader net and look at mathematician as an actors category so that I can look at the role and image, and part of that being masculinity, of the mathematician as a process sort of negotiating. So although there were a handful of women who subscribed and contributed to the monthly, none were featured in its biographies. Of course, this sort of erasure from the records and stories of science has made writing about women in science an important academic and political project that I think is an important project that ties into relevant questions about the broader relationship between gender and science. Since the mid-20th century, feminist scholarship has revealed deep-seated conceptions of objectivity as a masculine endeavor with feminized nature as its conquest. As scholars began to consider gender itself as an important category of analysis, cultural historical studies of science have identified different gradations and many different forms of masculinity in relation to the production of knowledge. So masculinity is expressed through elite social status were, of course, kind of central to the development of modern science in Europe. Studies of scientific masculinity specific to the United States have featured rugged outdoorsmen, middle-class professionals, rogue individualists. And as many scholars of gender and science have demonstrated, these kind of particular expressions of culturally esteemed masculinity have been used in a variety of ways to kind of add value and validity to the science that these people are performing. The relationship between gender and mathematics, however, has not been studied as thoroughly as between gender and other sciences. And not too surprisingly, the former is sometimes aligned pretty well with mathematics and science, and sometimes they depart. As the quote unquote language of science, mathematics was deeply embedded in Enlightenment attempts to read the quote unquote book of nature. but more abstract forms seem to kind of complicate this relationship between manly mind and womanly object. And while mathematics is often considered the epitome of masculine objectivity, so on the one hand, it's seen as a very manly and kind of a field that is meant to be studied by men and these abstract minds, it's also served as an entry point for women who may have been excluded in different points in time from the physical spaces like the laboratory or the machine shop. So while important historical work has been done to talk about the role and experiences of women in mathematics, there are not many studies that consider specifically the relationship between gender and mathematics. What's been written has demonstrated the importance not only considering the kind of cultural assumptions about mathematics overall, but the values and practices of different kinds of mathematics. So Mary Terrell has written about 18th century analysis as sort of this bulwark of scientific rationalism based in the all-male space of the French Academy of Sciences, which was held separate from the sort of feminized metaphysics in women-led salons. Kind of flip to that, Lorraine Daston has talked about the epistemological status of calculation and how, as that was declining towards the turn of the 19th century, calculation became an appropriate form of work for women or for machines. Although the production of mathematics in many of these situations is kind of associated with the non-physical work of disembodied theory, it's still often imbued with this celebration of male genius and male bodies. So as explained in his biography, Elisha Scott Loomis was born in Medina County, Ohio. While working as a farmhand in his early teens, Loomis helped support his widowed mother and younger siblings. He once walked 7 miles to buy an algebra book, which he mastered on his own. So detailed in his monthly stories. After years of teaching and studying, Loomis eventually became the chair of mathematics at Baldwin University and the local engineer for the village of Berea. Like Loomis, many of the American mathematicians featured in this journal began working from a young age to pay for their educations and to help support their families. They traveled far to attend second-rate schools, were largely self-taught. And eventually the hardworking mathematician, so the story goes, built a career for himself. Some became principals and superintendents. Most became professors. Others found non-teaching jobs as calculators, surveyors, and observatory assistants. So while the details of each of these stories and biographies are a little different, many of them echo and have this common theme of this celebration of the self-made man, which was quite loudly celebrated in the 19th century United States. According to stories, and there were many, many of them in print by the end of the century, America had become a nation of strivers. Among other things, the rise of the market economy had transformed American conceptions of selfhood from this idea of Republican independence to capitalist ambition. Self-making became a central feature of stories about a variety of characters in the United States, including scientists. So the story of the kind of farm-raised scholar, grew up poor, didn't have a lot of opportunity, but showed promise, kind of helped to create this archetype of the self-made mathematician, and also to reinforce these stereotypes of other self-made Americans. After detailing the story, his self-making story of Loomis, how he rose from rags to relative riches, obviously never made that much money as a mathematician, but the final paragraph of his biography explains, quote, "Today, many young men who are failing in life, beholding those who are succeeding, say, why have luscious plums of success fallen in their mouths, while in mine have fallen the bitter almonds of adversity? The answer is, plums do not fall in a successful man's mouth by chance. He takes hold of the tree upon which fortune hangs and shakes it bravely and manfully." So Loomis and other self-made mathematicians were praised in their biographies for attributes like hard work and self-reliance that were, of course, commonly gendered masculine and developed in contrast to ongoing assumptions about women as fanciful and dependent. As Loomis's biography demonstrates, failure itself was often feminized as well. And by associating Loomis with action, manliness, and success, his biography in the monthly sort of set him in opposition to both elite scholars and lazy failures. So according to Amir Alexander, historical depictions of mathematicians have often been informed by the style and content of the mathematics they're producing. So specifically, Alexander points to a change in the narrative that was used to describe European mathematicians in the early 19th century that also coincided with a broader change in the nature of mathematical inquiry. So while Enlightenment mathematicians like Euler and D'Alembert were often celebrated as successful public figures, beginning in the early 1800s, romantic misfortunes like the early death of Galois and the destitution of Abel began to dominate the narrative. At the same time as this narrative was sort of shifting, there was what many have called a new beginning in mathematics. So there's a modern form of inquiry where methods and concepts are studied and perfected in and of themselves, totally separate from any sort of external value or interpretation. So as these developments in modern mathematics become increasingly untethered to physical reality, the mathematicians who were doing this kind of research were cast as reclusive geniuses and often accused of living in their own strange worlds. So in general, American mathematicians were not really involved in the development of these modern forms of mathematics throughout the 19th century. But as increasing numbers of young American scholars began to study in Europe, they found and brought back with them a century's worth of leading ideas in modern fields. American mathematicians who practiced abstract mathematics, however, risked being associated with less than favorable forms of European elitism. So this modern abstract mathematics was often considered European or foreign mathematics. Farmtown roots, however, were presented often in these monthly biographies as an asset amid the changing values and practices within the professional community. According to his biography, John Newton Lyle once rode all day in the sweltering heat to a nearby town to purchase Charles Davy's Elements of Differential and Integral Calculus. So he got his book, returned home to his family's farm, found a quiet spot in the forest, and worked through the book on his own. So these sort of bucolic stories of the American on his farm, but still kind of pursuing his mathematics were pretty common in the journal. References to their agrarian roots kind of tied these mathematicians to a particular version of the self-making American story. At the same time, American urbanization and the expansion of industrial capitalism meant that while the nation had been founded as a republic of agrarian households, the proportion of Americans living and working on farms was decreasing significantly in the 19th century when these biographies were being written. By the turn of the 20th century, urbanization and changes in work had prompted a growing level of reverence for farm work. And at the same time, the rise of university-based and professional work contributed to this sort of ongoing tension between those who worked with their hands in the traditional sense and those who held pen to paper. In general, monthly biographies were written against a backdrop of potentially emasculating circumstances, the closing of the frontier, widespread urbanization, rampant debt tied to the depressions of the 1890s, dehumanizing factory jobs, and the increasing prevalence of women workers and activists. Scholars like Gail Biederman, however, are hesitant to label the period a crisis in masculinity. No one, Biederman explains, seemed to doubt the link between male bodies, a man's identity, and his right to power. And as an ongoing ideological process, gender itself kind of implies this continual contradiction, change, and renegotiation. Specifically looking at the gendering of scholarship, while still considered a manly pursuit, was also continually renegotiated in different ways. To a certain extent, urban gentlemen who pursued intellectual activities failed to express certain forms of masculinity. They may have lacked the sort of manliness wrought from the aggressiveness of the business world or the physicality of the frontier. And so when I'm looking at these biographies and the monthly in general, you can see this sort of negotiation and foregrounding of different forms of masculinity as this shift to kind of urban scholarship is going on more broadly in the profession. Like other American sciences, mathematics in the United States shifted during the progressive era from sort of practical and educational activities towards research. Unlike other American sciences, however, mathematics was growing conspicuously apart from physical reality. So people were really noticing this difference in the kinds of mathematics that professionals were working on. And so by choosing to encode their professional identities in these ideals of abstractions, mathematicians, I argue, forfeited access to kind of more traditional forms of masculinity that were associated with the military associations with mathematics or industrial applications of mathematics. And so instead, in these biographies are marshaling other forms tied to nostalgic traditions of farm work, the rugged individualism, and eventually, later in the 20th century, professional exclusivity and prestige. Overall, when the mathematics community was under construction in the United States, so too was the image of the American mathematician. And so these biographies in the monthly helped to construct and in the process to gender the categories of American mathematics, essentially working to align deep-seated American ideals with the time-honored pursuit of mathematics. Thank you, and I'm happy to talk more about any of these parts in the questions, but appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And I want to remind everybody who's in our audience that you can put your questions into the chat to me as they arise, and I will raise them at the end to kick off the discussion. For all of the papers together, we'll have the discussion. Our next paper is by Daniela Barberis, who is currently Assistant Professor of History of Science at North Central College. She has published a range of articles on the history of French sociology, psychology, neurology, and philosophy. She's currently working on a book on the development of French epistemology in the 19th and 20th century. Her paper is titled Precarious Masculinity, Male Hysteria and Male Identity in Late 19th Century France.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. I seem to be having... I'm sorry, I can't seem to be finding a PowerPoint among the choices of things I can share. Sorry about that. Here we go. Good. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending our session. Today I'm going to be talking about male hysteria in the 19th century, particularly as presented by Jean-Martin Charcot. So Charcot was a French professor of anatomical pathology and is considered one of the founders of neurology. It was central to the institutionalization of the discipline in France. Charcot was one of the major proponents of the existence of hysteria in the male and can be considered largely responsible for the acceptance of this notion by the late 19th century medical profession. The claim was controversial and medical specialists were divided on this issue. In offering a neurological etiology of the disease, Charcot was challenging the existing gynecological models of the disorder, many of which advocated radical surgery as a cure. Ovariotomies were the most up-to-date versions of this treatment, but hysterectomies were also common between 1875 and 1885. Charcot's original model of hysteria was developed from the observation of female patients at the Salpêtrière Hospital, one of the major Paris hospitals and a hospice also for elderly women with over 5,000 women patients. Charcot spent virtually his entire career at this institution. In 1882, at Charcot's instigation, a new special ward opened in the hospital, a service for men, a 20-bed ward specifically reserved for men suffering from nervous disorders. 2 years later, this ward was expanded to house 50 beds. By the first half of the 1880s, Charcot had assembled a significant patient pool for his study of male hysteria. He published more than 60 case histories in the 1880s. In one of his earliest presentations of male hysteria, Charcot placed a male and a female patient with similar symptoms side by side and compared the two cases. Although Charcot emphasized the similarity of the symptoms of the two patients, he was quick to point out that the hysteria they presented was not typical, but abnormal by the absence of convulsive crisis. He then went on to say of the male patient, I quote, "These adult men who are prey to hysterical neurosis do not always present characteristics of femininity. Far from it. They are, at least in a majority of cases, robust men presenting all the attributes of the male sex, soldiers or artisans married and the fathers of families, men, in other words, and one would be surprised, unless forewarned, to meet with an illness considered by most people as exclusive of women." Charcot had started his work on hysteria in the 1870s by trying to distinguish between hysterical and epileptic fits. The first phase of his studies on hysteria culminated in the description of a 4-phase hysterical attack, an attack modeled on that of epilepsy, which he labeled grande hystérie, or hysteria major. The phases were as follows. The first one was called epileptoid, consisted of tonic seizures, often preceded by an aura, which rose from the hysterogenic points. The second phase was called grand mouvement, and consisted of contortions and acrobatic postures. The third phase consisted of attitude passionnelle, emotional gestures and verbalization, often reenacting a traumatic event. And the fourth phase was a final delirium, which was also the dissolution of the attack. Besides the attack, hysteria was also characterized by what Charcot called stigmata, or permanent symptoms, and by contractures or paralysis of any part of the body. The stigmata were of two kinds: hysterogenic points and disturbances of sensibility. And here you can see a slide in which the areas of disturbance of sensibility are mapped out on a female patient. So the disturbances of sensibility could be either anesthesias or hyperesthesias, that is, lowered or heightened sensibility. Hysterogenic points could be located in any area of the body and could be used by simple pressure upon them to provoke or stop an attack already underway. The other classical stigmata were hemianesthesias, a loss of sensibility that usually followed the midline of the body, rather than anatomical features. And you can see there the hemianesthesia on a male patient. Although this complete set of symptoms was rarely present in a single patient, the description was offered as a type encompassing the full set of possible symptoms. After 1880, Charcot began to experiment with hypnosis on his hysterical patients. He conceived of hypnosis as an artificial nervous state during which he could reproduce and modify hysterical symptoms. He mostly worked in the state he called lethargy, a state in which, according to him, consciousness was entirely abolished because the higher mental functions of the brain were inactive. Only the spinal cord was still active. He believed the phenomena produced in the state were reflex phenomena. He found he could produce paralysis and contractures at will in this state. Charcot then hypothesized that when hysterical patients underwent a traumatic event, whether physical or emotional, they tended to enter an alternate state of consciousness, similar to the lethargic state, during which their paralysis and contractures were developed through neuromuscular hyperexcitability, a purely neurological reaction. Even if lightly struck on a limb or a part of the body, the special state of excitability would allow these small traumas to be converted into major paralysis and contractures. This helped explain the lack of proportion between the gravity of the accident and the gravity of the symptoms. The picture of hysteria that emerges from Charcot's collected works is, generally speaking, similar for male and female patients. The disorder in both sexes was a hereditary degenerative malady of the nervous system with an extensive symptomatology, a varying pattern of evolution, and largely unfavorable prognosis. Charcot often insisted on the essential equivalence of the hysteria of the two sexes. In his earliest published lectures on male hysteria, Charcot asked his audience repeatedly, "Hysteria thus exists in men? Can hysteria develop in men?" in order to affirm the equivalence of the condition in both sexes. This was obviously a strong argument in favor of a neurological causation for the disease, in opposition to a gynecological one. Although men lacked one of the common hysterogenic points present in women, ovary, an irritation of the ovarian region that could provoke and stop attacks, they had equivalent areas in the testicles, especially if these manifested any abnormality. In some cases, Charcot and his students even argued that their male patients presented pseudo-ovarian zones in the area of the abdomen corresponding to the position of the ovaries in the female body that could act as hysterogenic points. So in my slide, you can see that this patient that is drawn here has two hysterogenic points, the dark spots on his body, one which is roughly in his the area in a pseudo-ovarian area, and then he also has a testicular hysterogenic point. There's a paradoxical aspect in this emphasis on ovarian and testicular signs of the disease, while at the same time arguing for a neurological etiology. The connection of the malady with the sexual sphere is retained, even if it is somewhat ambiguous. Charcot tended to layer theories rather than to truly discard them. Underneath neurological hysteria, gynecological hysteria can still be found, as in the archaeological layers of the unconscious later described by Freud, who, by the way, was briefly Charcot's student. Thus, one can argue that in order to equate male and female hysteria, male hysterics were being subliminally feminized. However, while similarities abound, Charcot's cases of male hysteria have characteristics that separate them on average from female hysteria. Charcot took pains to point out that grande hystérie in its most complete form was to be found in the male, and that men presented all the typical stigmata of the disease. However, most cases of male hysteria were cases of traumatic hysteria, mostly monosymptomatic with extremely persistent symptoms. Over a third of his male patients exhibited no attack at all. And in the cases that presented the full-blown hysterical attack, the four phases were somewhat different in males. The most intense phases tended to be the first two, the epileptoid and the great movement phases, characterized by striking and stylized postures, such as the arched pelvis position. So here we have a lithograph of a female patient in the contortion phase, with this arched position. And here we have a photograph of a male patient in a similar position. So the maintaining these positions often required considerable muscular strength. Less present in men was a third phase, that of passionate attitudes. So I'm just going to show you a couple of other contortions, which you can see are sort of modifications of the same position in other angles, basically. So the last phase of the attack, when present in men, that of so-called attitude passionnelle, was characterized by the hallucinatory reenactment of emotional scenes from the patient's past. In male patients, the range of emotions manifested in this phase was quite a bit narrower than in women, and it tended towards sad, depressive end of the emotional spectrum and towards anger. As Mark McCauley has pointed out, in a substantial number of cases, 41%, the stage was absent altogether in men. Male cases were, in general, emotionally muted compared to female cases then. When comparing the general psychic state of the two sexes, Charcot pointed out that male hysterics do not present the capricious and volatile changes of humor and personality that are habitually present in female patients and often regarded as characteristic of hysteria. Charcot again argues that although more male patients are depressed and melancholic, this can also be the case in female hysterics. La donna è mobile, but not always. Yet hysteria was defined at the Salpêtrière as an illness of excess. Hysterical patients were never, almost never, in a normal state. Either their organs were too active, or on the contrary, their functions were diminished to the point of being suppressed. Female patients usually presented a large array of changing symptoms, contractures and paralysis of the limbs, of the larynx, of internal organs, appeared and disappeared constantly. Male hysterics, by contrast, usually presented one symptom, the result of a work-related accident, and which remained with the patient for extremely long periods. In men, the permanent symptoms of hysteria were particularly tenacious and resistant to treatment. I quote, "In the male, the disease presents itself often as an affection remarkable for the permanence and tenacity of the symptoms that characterize it. In the woman, on the contrary, and that is without doubt what seems to make the crucial difference between the sexes for those who do not know the illness well, in women, what is thought to be the characteristic trait of hysteria is its instability, the mobility of its symptoms." End quote. This mobility was not an omnipresent characteristic, as those who, like Charcot, knew the ailment in depth were aware. Nevertheless, the contrast between stability and instability as corresponding to male and female patients holds. The majority of Charcot's male patients were working-class men, masons, train engineers, bakers, factory workers. They were, that is, either laborers in the new large-scale mechanized industries or more often members of the traditional artisanal class. Here are some examples of how they were described. I quote, "A vigorous man, a blacksmith of 35 years of age, married, and the father of several children." End quote. Rig, a big man, strong and well-developed. He was formerly a cooper and stood hard work without fatigue. Has had 9 children. Guy, age 27, working as a locksmith. He has shown himself in his profession skillful and intelligent. He has even obtained in locksmith competitions medals for his work. End quote. There's a noticeable emphasis on the capacity for hard work and on the good work ethics of the patients before contracting their ailment. As Michel Luerd has noted, it was specifically the inability of these patients to work due to their nervous disabilities that defined them as sick in the eyes of their middle-class physicians and led to their diagnosis and hospitalization. Charcot's female patients were also mostly working class: seamstresses, washing women, maids, and flower sellers. Yet Charcot does not seem to have made any conceptual cut between upper and lower class hysterical women. Charcot's private female hysterical patients have not been studied comparatively, so we do not know how he may have labeled them. In the case of male patients, however, we do know that Charcot used the diagnostic category of neurasthenia for upper-class patients in his private practice, who presented symptoms very similar to those he diagnosed as male hysteria in his hospital patients. Neurasthenia was assumed to result in a large number of cases from intellectual overwork. By labeling his private patients neurasthenics, Charcot associated them with a disease linked to the higher mental faculties, rather than to the lower reflex and automatic ones, and to the stressful conditions of modern civilized life. The diagnosis also had a more hopeful prognosis and was less offensive to patient sensibilities than that of hysteria. It should be noted that Pierre Janet, who obtained his medical degree with Charcot and eventually held the chair of psychology at the Collège de France, developed a theory of hysteria which argued that what lay at the center of the ailment was a splitting of consciousness which rested on an innate psychological weakness. Hysteria was, according to him, a disease due to weakness, and it developed most readily when a mind, which was innately weak, was submitted to influences that weakened it still further, or was faced with heavy demands in relation to which its weakness stood out still more. Thus, Janet regarded a particular form of congenital mental weakness as a disposition for hysteria. Hysteria was thus almost a form of feeble-mindedness. Charcot avoided branding male hysterics as effeminate in one respect, since they were portrayed as big, strong, sexually active working men, but he nevertheless conceptually feminized them by distinctly associating hysteria and hypnosis to the lower mental functions. Male and female hysterics were brought together by their closeness to animality, their proximity to, and therefore easier relapse into the lower mental functions. Closer to nature than upper-class men, hysterical men are closely linked to women, who have traditionally been linked to nature through the biological processes of childbearing. Hysterical men thus lie between hysterical women and the ideal of the normal man. The stability typical of their symptoms draws them closer to the ideal of the Victorian bourgeois man, supposedly characterized by emotional stability, while hysteria and susceptibility to hypnosis bring him closer to women. I believe that the fact that hysteria was regarded as a relapse to an inferior psychical state has not been given sufficient theoretical importance, and that it adds an interesting twist to Charcot's conception of hysteria in the male. Although Macaulay and others, such as Showalter, are right in trying to qualify the picture of 19th century hysterics, and while the fact that this category was applied to men is certainly important, I believe the general notion that hysteria is a female malady is basically correct. And I leave you with this famous painting of Charcot in his practice demonstrating with a famous hysterical patient, a woman, as you can see, and his entire staff composed of male physicians. Right, you can see the nurses at the far right corner, but otherwise, this, intent male gaze upon the female patient. It's very much characteristic of hysteria. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Our final presentation is Nicole Hudgins, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Baltimore and the author of The Gender of Photography, a 2020 publication. For those of you who are interested in a new and exciting read, you can get a preview of it right there on her screen. And several articles on how women and men used photography before 1920. Nicole, take it away.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And it's so lovely to see all my fellow panelists after a couple of months of emailing back and forth. So this is a lot of fun. And I see a couple of friends and colleagues in the audience. I really appreciate you coming. So what I'm going to do is share my screen, the correct screen. And it's another reason why it's not so nerve-wracking is because all fall I had practiced doing this with students in the classroom, so it's not too bad. I hope I'm not too much of a tiny little post stamp as I give the paper, but I'll have more slides later. Feminist historians have for decades shown us how the novel Republican form of government that emerged from the North Atlantic Revolutionary era generated a fraternal system of power in which female input, which had supposedly characterized the pre-revolutionary regime of royals, regents, and mistresses, was eliminated from government. Although historian Mona Ozouf had argued that mixed-sex sociability continued to distinguish French culture, institutions in France, as in Britain and the United States, remained bastions of masculine power throughout the 19th century. What can be described as intellectual republicanism, male-dominated, cross-class, and institutional, flourished even during the Second French Empire, when that regime forced political republicanism underground. Like other learned associations of the era, the photographic societies that emerged in London, Paris, and the East Coast cities of North America used the model of intellectual republicanism for their production and valorization of knowledge. The new photographic societies became the structures through which knowledge could be made into property. Similarly to other learned societies across the North Atlantic world, like the medicine and mathematics that my two colleagues discussed. Indeed, photography was just one of the techniques that converted knowledge to power in the second half of the 19th century, akin to the period's more prestigious geographical and mathematical and medical associations. In looking at the membership roles and printed discussions in the earliest photographic journals, often mouthpieces of the clubs, what becomes apparent is that male enthusiasts were creating private republics around their passion for the new art science. Photography historian Jennifer Tucker also observed that few developments, quote, did more than photography to establish the public image of Victorian science as a middle-class masculine practice, end quote. Scientific professionals, businessmen, aristocratic dilettantes, and military men here met on equal terms for the sake of photography's progress, but also for the sake of their identity as men. When mid to late 19th century photo clubs or editorial staff published portraits celebrating their institution's progress, the selection was strictly masculine, as of the example that you see here. Women practitioners' faces would never be shown during this 50-year period. And what I just want to emphasize is that women practitioners from the amateur to the professional, they were there, they were practicing and they existed, but they did not, their faces did not appear. One might read the rules of the earliest photographic societies as gender neutral or even welcoming toward women, but this would be misleading. Published in its journal at various intervals, the original rules of the London Photographic Society, for example, explicitly stated, quote, ladies also shall be eligible as members of the society, end quote. Although this provision and the inclusion of Viscountesses Jocelyn and Hawarden in the 1860s made female membership at least thinkable, women's attendance at meetings was exceedingly rare. Moreover, women members were never selected as society officers during this period. Arguably, what the Photographic Society desired was the prestige of these ladies' titles on the rolls, not their discursive input. Both in France and Britain, the inclusion of aristocratic members gave polish to a nevertheless masculine, Republican-style framework of the Photography Society. In emerging when it did, the new Photographic Society fulfilled members' need to define themselves as modern urban men. The mid-19th century saw not only the expanding influence of democracy, but the disorienting impact of industrialization and advanced urbanization as well. As North Atlantic civilization changed, the definition and meaning of manhood and masculinity would evolve as well. Competing in a crowded city where the values of knowledge and skill gradually eclipse traditional masculine values of physical strength and martial valor, middle-class leaders set to work building new secular institutions to replace ones that had become defunct, such as the traditional guild system of trades. Sociologist Marianne Clausen argued that one of the important ways that men replaced guilds was by continuing their traditions in fraternal associations, such as the Freemasons and the Knights of Columbus. The spirit of fraternalism pervaded the first photographic societies too, and the concept of fraternity was a favored subject among their members. Quote, photographers as a body are a most cordial fraternity, wrote J.J. Coghill in 1859. And in general, I think there has been an expansive and generous desire among the body to keep nothing back from the brotherhood which might tend to the general good, end quote. In a cutthroat environment of business competition, fraternalism encouraged emulation, solidarity, and brotherly friendship. For its members, the Photographic Society attempted to mitigate the nasty effects of cyclical economic downturns, price wars, and retail oversaturation, all of which stoked studio rivalries in the second half of the century. At the same time, the Photographic Club positioned itself as a learned society in emulation of prestigious institutions like the Académie des Sciences. The first president of the French Photographic Society, Eugène Durieux, linked the society to a national constellation of learned academies in 1855. Quote, if between men devoted to the same subject of study, inspired by the same tastes, if among savants or artists they establish a natural confraternity, why would this not also be the case for photographers? Durieux's fellow member Paul Perrier agreed, employing one of his many Latin analogies. Quote, our confraternity of photographers is a republic in which the queveillant consules, that is, executive members, should be checked daily by the Senate. Perrier's comment revealed some political sublimation during the restrictive reign of Napoleon III. Just as importantly, Durieux, Perrier, and the other members of the Photographic Society were establishing a masculine republic where liberté, égalité, and fraternité could legally thrive in a non-political association. As fraternal republics, early associations used language to gender photographic knowledge as male, and as with all fraternal associations, assert patriarchal power. As Clausen pointed out, the growth of the fraternal organization strengthened the bourgeois man's authority within the family, since he was acting as an emissary between his dependents and the outside world of knowledge and power. His power in the family was legitimated in a way that a woman's could not be, through his participation in knowledge producing and reviewing networks. The corollary of this formula was that if women attended, contributed to, or heaven forbid, directed learned society meetings, men's dominion over the family would collapse. Sociologist Daphne Spain put it this way: gendered spaces separate women from knowledge used by men to produce and reproduce power and privilege. In the United States, too, fraternal spirit in photographic organizations, as in the various lodges of the day, articulated a vision of unity and brotherhood among men of disparate social statuses. This spirit became especially apparent in the earliest American organizations for commercial photographers now, beginning with the founding of the National Photographic Association, NPA, in 1869 by East Coast studio photographers. Formed for the pragmatic purpose of fighting the patent on the use of bromide in the collodion negative photographic process, the NPA's rhetoric, coming soon after the national trauma of the Civil War, soared toward loftier ideals. Quote, we come from the North, the South, the East, and West, all as a common brotherhood, spoke President Bogardus at the first annual conference. By our presence and efforts to lift our art higher and higher until it should attain the proud eminence it deserves, unquote. Unfortunately, once the goal of overturning the bromide patent was achieved, infighting and indifference led to the folding of the NPA in 1876. A national organization for professionals was resurrected, however, in 1880. The new association, the Photographers Association of America, that's PAA, used the same Republican fraternal language as its predecessor, which now had two main aims. PAA leadership hoped the rhetoric of professional brotherhood might generate solidarity during a national economic slump that had sparked studio price wars. Secondly, the PAA could promote photography as a manly and honorable profession by countering any reported incidents or innuendos that besmirched the profession's reputation in the eyes of the public. At the PAA's first convention in Chicago, its secretary, A.J.W. Copeland, told attendees, quote, in the work we have come here to perform, let us be earnest, manly, mutually friendly, and brotherly. Let us do all the good we can for ourselves and the craft at large. Later, H. Rocher delivered a paper on the relation of photographers to the public and the public to the photographers, in which he exhorted his colleague to guard your dignity, exclamation point, to avoid being taken advantage of, quote, be firm in what you transact with your patrons. I am firm and deviate not from my rules or prices, end quote. Rocher, Ryder, Wilson, and other leaders of the PAA hoped that by disciplining the fraternity could then discipline its customers. Although attendees at the Chicago convention included women, speakers addressed the crowd as ladies and gentlemen. The PAA aspired to serve a body of intelligent men, and it neither scheduled female speakers nor solicited concerns from female members during this era. Unlike the European photographic journals that distanced themselves from photographic commerce in favor of pure science, several of the earliest American journals were published and edited by photographic supply manufacturers themselves. And I'll kind of give you, here's an example of the ads that they ran in the journals. Distributed at a cheap subscription rate, publications like Anthony's Photographic Bulletin, Humphrey's Journal, and Photographic Rays of Light combined the goal of advertising with a purported desire to advance the interest of the fraternity and to raise the standard of the most beautiful of the arts. Promoting new products as well as professional esprit de corps, businessmen editors advised, quote, there should be a brotherly feeling among photographers, for there is wisdom in a multitude of counsel. One man who lived by this advice was the Philadelphia photographer Edward L. Wilson. I'll show you a portrait of him, who by directing 2 journals, co-founding the national organization, fighting restrictive patents, and promoting the art at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition, did all that an individual could do to increase the honor of the photographic profession. The galloping masculinization of photography as both a profession and an organized recreation proceeded apace, and reporters recorded little protest against that before 1890. One notable exception came from the American photographer Marcelia W. Barnes, who upon learning of the New York State Daguerrean Association's formation in 1852, wrote a full-page letter to the Photographic Art Journal. Barnes was, quote, anxious to know whether female operators were to share its friendship and receive of its benefits. Feeling that female daguerreotypists were not cordially welcomed into the fraternity, she demanded that the new association publish a resolution on the subject. The end result, according to historian Peter Palmquist, was that Barnes and her colleague Agnes M. Armstrong were duly elected as the first female members of the American Photographic Association. Unfortunately, Barnes was an exception to the rule of female silence during Photographic Society's first decade. Although the art journal's editors showed liberality in publishing her letter, the fraternity of the Photographic Society, in any event its meetings, would remain a masculine domain until the 1880s at the earliest. Clubs and associations were pleased to accept women's payment of dues and their donations, but relied upon their passive silence. The early photographic press praised the new art for its ability to bring the world, quote, face to face with its great men, its orators, its poets, its statesmen, its heroes. So the idea of photography kind of reproducing this masculine greatness. The mass publication of photographs of men of note, which strengthened the male domination of public esteem. Mass-produced portraits of women tended to be of actresses, beauties, and royals, not women of scientific or professional achievement, who certainly did toil during the same period. Volumes arrived off the presses with photo-based illustrations, celebrating the nation's male heroes for schoolboys to emulate. Photographers, too, hoped to gain entry to this modern pantheon, and such a campaign demanded strict avoidance of femininity. The great task of the photographic societies and journals would be to make their new probational profession manly. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you to all of our panelists and audience for being present. I am, okay. I have just allowed it so that people can unmute themselves if they'd like to ask a question. I'm going to have a few statements and then pose the questions that I have and the ones that were sent to me to our panelists. So I want to make a few comments myself, having listened to, obviously, and read and appreciated all of this work. There are some very strong connecting threads between each of these papers. Reading through them all, I was constantly reminded, because of the similar periodization of Teddy Roosevelt's assertions about manhood and man-making surrounding the turn of the century. For example, he agreed with the mathematicians that Ellen's talking about, that true manhood had to involve both intellectual and physical pursuits. What's interesting, however, is that his determined self-actualizing as a man included not coming from a farm, which is the background that was so promoted in those scientific journals, and being self-taught, but taking himself from his effete city life to the frontier to make a man of himself outside, which I think is a really interesting contrast, kind of a reverse take of this journey of these men in mathematics that you're talking about. I also found it fascinating that Charcot believed that men experiencing hysterical ailments were longer-term patients, because I know that in the United States, treatment took such a different approach, confining women to beds in the long term to restore their femininity and sending men quickly out to ranches to cure them of their feminized nature. So Charcot's description of these ailing men as masculine emphasizes the real uniqueness and distinctness of his approach, I think, which is very interesting. I also found this revelation that he viewed neurasthenia as a result of the intellectual work of the upper classes absolutely fascinating, because this diagnosis was, in my research, by contrast, unflatteringly applied to urbanites that those like Max Nordau described as degenerative examples of modern manhood. So it's very interesting, the kind of contrasting intent on diagnosing men with hysteria versus neurasthenia. I also found it particularly interesting that Nicole's paper highlights this theme in the photographic profession, which is largely rhetorical but invisible in a very visible profession, which is very interesting. The photographs that Ellen was showing, for example, they do have these very masculine stances. You know, you describe it in your paper, looking off into the distance, the kind of the 3/4 pose. And the photographs that you showed us, Nicole, very different, right? Men in kind of reclined positions, these self-portraits, they're all much more varied. I mean, maybe it's the artistic background, but I think it's particularly fascinating that in this fully visual culture, the masculine dominance is coming out verbally, not aesthetically so much. So I thought that was very interesting. So these 3 papers, I want to thank you again for submitting them. They're excellent. They all show, I think, intentionally masculinizing processes being applied to different areas, a diagnosis, an intellectual pursuit, and a profession. So I'll begin with some questions to the panelists. I still urge anyone who doesn't want to ask their questions out loud to submit them to me, and I can read them out, but you're also welcome to hit the little raise hand button or turn on your cameras and raise your hand as well. Any of that is just fine. So to begin, to both Ellen and Daniela, I'd like to ask a question on masculinity and ethnicity in your research. My own research is on Jewish masculine identity, as you guys know. So you're both writing about areas in which there's much discussion of Jewishness at different times. Freud, for example, who Daniela, you pointed out, actually worked with Charcot, wrote about male menstruation and hysteria as unique to the highly feminized Jewish male. So I thought that was, I'd like to hear your view on that and his view on ethnicity and masculinity. And while in mathematics, I'm curious, excuse me, if the more feminized theoretical abstract mathematics, because you talked about abstract mathematics being more of a feminized field, I'm curious if that field was dominated by a certain group or category of men, like German Jews, who I know were very dominant in that field at different times, who are also cast as feminine in nature, both inside and outside of the academy, particularly in Germany, but also in the United States as well. So whichever of you wants to respond first,
I can go first, or if you'd want to go, I'm okay with that too. Okay, so there are actually some interesting things to be said about masculinity and ethnicity, particularly regarding Jewish, the presentation of Jewishness by Charcot. Charcot generally does not publish anything about his upper class patients. He has notes, and there's been some investigation of his material. So there is material available about his private practice, but all the publications, both about men and women, are only from his hospital patients. He was a very successful private practitioner with very fancy clientele, which included the Emperor of Brazil, among other people. So obviously being discreet was in his best interest. But he has this strange paper. I mean, there's not only hysteria that he's interested in. He's interested in a very broad range of neurological diseases, and he construes the story of the wandering Jew as a neurological disease. So he basically says, oh, this story developed because there are these patients who basically become vagrant homeless people who have this degenerative condition which leads them to wander. And so they then somehow have been transformed into the story or the myth of the wandering Jew, but this is really a neurological condition that can be diagnosed. And he has a few cases in his hospital. This is part of a larger program that you could say the Charcot and his school has, because they have this whole sort of projecting back into history of hysteria, in which they go back and look at witchcraft and various kinds of artistic representations of the past, and line them all up as being all instances of the same thing, thereby making their syndrome that they are defining a universal, real fact, if that makes sense, because it was always there. They can find it in Renaissance paintings, they can find it in witch trials. So what they do with the wandering Jew is similar to the witch move in some ways, but it also obviously reveals their own prejudices against Jews, and the notion that Jews are more inclined to be neurotic and more inclined to have some kind of degenerative nervous problem than other people. So, I mean, I think Freud kind of struggles with this to some extent, the way that he is discriminated against in, kind of subtle ways, but it's still there. I mean, he isn't like shut out or not, promoted, but he still has to be in these environments when these sorts of views are being propagated as science. They're basically the science of the time. So anyway, it's enough, I think, for the moment.
Yeah, thank you. I was also thinking similar questions listening to the other talk. So specifically looking at these late 19th century biographies, it is all of those being profiled are very much a kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and they do assert a lot of I've also written a little bit about the masculinity tied to their Christianity, that they assert being good Christian gentlemen, and that is very much kind of grounded in these biographies. But you do speak to a really important point that later, so there are conversations in Europe, as you mentioned, about, okay, this is this is a totally new kind of way of thinking about the world and about mathematics. And some people are really upset about it and freaking out about it. They're worried that, if mathematics is becoming totally detached from the world and also the spirit, it's something machines can do. And that does get racialized a little bit later. By some people are saying, okay, Germans think like this, and we're going to blame Jewish mathematicians for this like terrible turn towards abstraction. Also in physics in the 30s, Jude Physik and Deutsche Physik. So those kind of conversations are mostly localized in Europe. However, as a lot of those scholars come to the United States in the 30s, the conversations around ethnicity kind of are less blatant, perhaps, but I've looked at a lot of employment letters, and they'll say things like, we're looking for a non-Jew and a like Christian man in their letters, although some will say we already have one woman and one Jew in the department. And so that's like our quota. We can't take any more kind of thing. So there are some ways when, to a certain extent, they are associated with certain forms of mathematics, but it's also to a certain extent, they just become sort of a checkbox in a way that I would probably be familiar to a lot of us today. I also would love to chat more, Miriam, at some point. One of my later chapters looks specifically at a publication that comes out of the Yeshiva University. And it is kind of this network of Jewish mathematicians in New York City who are doing certain forms of work that I'm really interested in. But I think it does specifically tie into the masculinity question later on in this century, but there's not as much kind of discussion earlier when everyone's just assuming we're all, in this particular journal as well, born on a farm and taught ourselves mathematics and look at us go kind of situation. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Excellent, thank you. For Nicole, Civil War and death photography. I wanted to hear your kind of comments on that, because you very, very lightly touched on the Civil War, I think, in a mention in the paper. And I know that the photography in that period was so important during and after the events. And I'm curious if the significance of the practice itself, like, the ability to send death portraits to loved ones, elsewhere, affected the view of these photographers or the practice in general as a manly one.
Yeah, I didn't see it couched like that in the photographic journals that I looked at. And, if anything, what seemed to me was that, children were, and the relatives and loved ones, they were dying all the time, Civil War or not. And people created mementos by way of the photographer, but unfortunately that didn't really help the photographers gain any more respect. I think even through that, because it's the Civil War, but it's also before that and after, that the photographers, they struggled to be seen as respectable. They really did. And, even with like the services they provide like that, it was a constant struggle to separate we men of merit, from the charlatans who, give you a picture that then disappears the next day, or things like that. So yeah, I didn't see the posthumous photography couched in the language of masculinity in what I looked at.
Excellent. I have a question from Lauren Weingarten, who asked Daniela, does Charcot ever cite modern urban experience as a cause for male hysteria or neurasthenia? And also she asked, she says she works in 19th century censorship and pornography in France. Does Charcot address anything like male hysteria and exposure to pornography in terms of photography or posters or literature, etc.?
So to address the second point first, there is some discussion of men engaging in excessive sexual activity as weakening them. In the case of specific hysterical patients. I mean, this isn't like the widespread etiology, but it is one of the factors that is discussed. I mean, it's not per se exposure to pornography, it's more engaging with prostitutes. I mean, this is a common theme from the 18th century, right? The whole sort of literature on masturbation and the notion that if men engage in excessive masturbation, this is going to weaken them and sort of deplete their nervous system. So yeah, that's definitely there. I'm sorry, I kind of forgot the first question. I should have written it down.
No, it's all right. The first question was, did Charcot ever cite modern urban experience as a cause for male hysteria or neurasthenia?
That's definitely there, particularly in the workers that work in industrial settings. This is presented as toxic, as depleting, even just sort of in a sort of even a chemical kind of way, not, you know, like, oh, here are these men working in these very intense conditions with damaging chemicals and in this industrial setting. So there's sort of a proto labor defense in some of Charcot's work, where he's saying, you know, these men should not need to be protected. There need to be protections. People should not be exposed to these sorts of working conditions. That's why they become ill. I mean, a number of the men simply have accidents. They fall off scaffolding. They are hit by a horse, by a carriage as they are carrying out their work. But some of them are also, working in industries where they are being. He particularly discusses chemical exposure. So the whole urban industrial setting is discussed. I mean, for the upper class men with the neurasthenia, there is this notion of modern life as being. There's too much excitement, there's too much demands, too many newspapers to read, too many people around, too many telegrams from other countries. It's sort of like there's this notion that, this is overloading people. There's too much stimulus. It's sort of interesting because this is so old and this is still a thing with us, right? Like, we are now exposed to too many stimulus and this has negative consequences. But that is a very similar idea there.
What would he have made of Zoom, I wonder? I have a question from Daniela to Ellen. She says, Charcot crafted his self-image as a self-made man, although not quite like your mathematicians. There are definite parallels. The trope of individual effort leading to success is definitely there. Do you see your mathematicians as crafting their own image? And is photographic presentation a part of it? Charcot, she says, staged his own photographs.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the story of the self-made scientist, I think, is a really interesting, or even just the kind of lone genius scientist. So I've been trying to tease out the different, or kind of the connections or differences between the story of, okay, I started out, I taught myself these things and I became a well-known scientist, and how that does or doesn't tie into, I came up with all of these ideas on my own. And I've looked a little bit at so as the monthly was publishing these biographies of American mathematicians, which they were doing more than many of the other, the main other journal was the Bulletin of the American Mathematical Society that was publishing some obituaries and biographies of famous European mathematicians, which do really emphasize this kind of self-making story, but with, I think, a little bit of the differences. So they're not kind of focusing as much on this kind of farm down route is certainly a big part of the sort of American lens on it in these stories, but also kind of less in a way. What I'm interested in is the extent to which that story that they're crafting also informs then their identity as a scientist. So what I've read of a lot of the biographies of European scientists will put their self-making story into these biographies, but it's kind of not as foregrounded, or it's not as, and that's, what we need to take away from this, as it is in some of these other ones that I'm looking at of the American mathematicians. And yeah, the photographs are really interesting. The editors of the journal actually put out a call for all of their contributors to send in photographs of themselves if they wanted to have them published in the journal. So, they're trying to create this virtual community of mathematicians who in theory are in all different parts of the country, not necessarily just confined to the East Coast where meetings are happening. And so they put out a call. Not very many people sent in photographs, but there is one edition where there's just this kind of hodgepodge of these men in that kind of same setting, same status. And then I think, the question of the extent to which they're self-fashioning and they're kind of controlling the stories, whether or not they have a hand in the stories told about them, is an interesting question as well. The biographies were written by a lot of different people of these mathematicians, and sometimes mathematicians are still alive. Sometimes they're posthumous and more of an obituary. Sometimes the author will say, I knew this person because he was my teacher, or I knew this person because we grew up in the same small town. And so the questions of kind of how much of that is an image trying to be portrayed by the person being profiled or by the profiler is definitely part of the equation, for sure. The equation, yeah.
Well, I mean, Charcot is kind of a celebrity in his own time, and he has a school of students, and he isn't writing his own biography, but there's definitely a heroic narrative being promulgated by people who were his students or are his students when they are putting out these biographies. So it's kind of very conscious. And he has a number of photographs where he is sort of sticking his hand into his jacket in a Napoleonic gesture. And he was known as the Napoleon of the neurosis. So they're like journalists coming to his hospital and doing profiles of him. So he has, he's a little bit different in the sense of being much more of a celebrity than the average scientist. But I feel like he's definitely quite intentional in some of the things. Just another detail which I thought was interesting is that a lot of the cartes de visite that people use in the 19th century have photographs of them. And Charcot would hand these out, and Freud has a particular photograph of him that he still holds on to and treasures years and years later. Which is sort of interesting how much of an impact the fact that this person is giving you this photograph of themselves can have. Anyway, so.
Absolutely. I can imagine, his students writing about him also had certain, the politics of what they are talking about in the stories they're telling, I think is also pretty common in students writing about the scientists that trained them, for sure.
This question of photographs brings us back to Nicole. Nicole, I have a question here. Was there an attempt in the profession to argue that photography itself, not merely the behavior of the professionals, was a manly pursuit? Was any of this applied to the upper class hobbyists or amateurs who were involved in photography, or is this really strictly around the profession? Which I think actually also ties into the comment that you sent me, that there's this interesting difference between the kind of rugged physical masculinity that these mathematicians Ellen's talking about are promoting and the purely intellectual masculinity that your photographers are promoting. So I'd like to hear your comment on that.
Yes, it does, because the early societies in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s were a hodgepodge, of new people who want to be professional in the new studios, and scientists and people taking up it as a hobby, something that they're doing at home. They're together. It's kind of a republic of different classes and, different professions or non-professions, people doing it as a hobby, definitely. And then what was the second part of your question?
The second part was is the photography itself manly, and does it apply outside of the profession? That was that kind of.
Yes. Yeah, I would confidently say yes. And, once again, it's kind of interesting as I researched and wrote about this, that, the corollary applies, so that when girls showed interest in photography, in learning it, being amateurs or being artists, they were kind of sometimes gently discouraged because photography, for a number of reasons, was unladylike. So, both was at play, the men sort of making photography manly, and also kind of the perception that it was unladylike for women, although the really enthusiastic women just did it anyway. And that was sort of the amazing stories in my book, was just women, it really taught you a lesson, right? Just like stick to your guns, right? And do what you want to do despite what people say. There was one of the other thing I wanted to add. Oh, yes. I don't think I have a whole chapter about it, but there's a lot of sort of female allegories in the discussion of photography. So it's possible, like the mathematics and the physicians talked about this too, sort of nature as a woman, right? Nature, like the knowledge of nature to be taken, so there is this sort of gendering of photography, of the camera, of the sun, of nature, all of that, where, the photographer was the man, and the implements and the forces at work were female forces that he was to master.
Thank you. It's particularly interesting to me, having been a photographer for so long, and having always thought that the older generations of photographers who were teaching my generation were awfully chauvinist. But that could also have been because I think two of my professors in Chicago were Playboy photographers professionally. So I mean, there might have been some balance there. Also, Nicole, you sent a question for Daniela. You said you were wondering if she would say that Charcot and his followers thought both hysteria and neurasthenia were symptoms of a weak will, of a person unable to master him or herself, which I thought was a very interesting question.
Okay. I think that would be true. I think that the idea is that would be that hysterics have something sort of hereditarily wrong with them, and that's where the weakness stems from. While neurasthenics have depleted themselves through, excessive intellectual exertions or too much exposure to urban life or some variation thereof. And that's why the prognosis for neurasthenia tends to be more positive, because the idea is, if you stop reading so many books and take a cure, go to the Alps or something, then you're going to be fine. While with the hysterical patients, the notion is, once this has been sort of brought to the open, it's very hard for it to be. Charcot talks about this as a predisposition. So it's kind of like a genetic disease in some ways. You might have the predisposition and you might never be exposed to trauma of any kind that makes it come to the open. But once it has manifested itself, it's very difficult to for it to go away in any way. So that's why the prognosis is bad.
I appreciate you couching it in those terms. it kind of sounds like what you're saying to me is that the neurasthenic could be cured while the hysterical male had a hereditary problem.
Mhm.
Although, but you're saying that, the neurasthenic had the predisposition as well.
Oh, no, it's the hysteric that is presented as having a predisposition. So in a sense, you could have the hereditary taint, like your relatives could have had whatever, and that would mean that you have the hereditary taint, but it might conceivably not manifest if you lived in extremely favorable conditions. But once it manifests, that's how they explain the fact that most hysterical patients start having an issue after a specific trauma, whether it's an emotional trauma or a physical trauma, whether they fell off the scaffold or, in the case of women, very commonly, basically their employer or other trusted male figure tried to rape them.
So Charcot and his followers, they weren't, at the bottom of it, they weren't saying, like, buck up, be strong, master yourself. They weren't saying that. Okay.
No, they didn't think you could do that. It's very sympathetic in some ways, and in other ways it's very hopeless. So it's kind of a strange mixture, right? They present this is something that the person is not responsible for. On the other hand, the prognosis is that they don't have a whole lot they can do for this person. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a mixed, but a lot of what Charcot does, and this is true for the female patients too, is dispute the common presentation of the hysterical woman as just sort of a whimsical woman who wants to do whatever, and they just throw a fit when they don't get their way.
Yeah, I would assume that Charcot and whoever would say, oh, well, women, they're weak, well, they're not strong enough, but men, we expect them to kind of power through.
That's not really there, even though in some sense it is there, right? Because it's sort of like the men, the women tend to be more flighty, as I discussed, or have more, but this is also not something that they can control. That's part of the whole idea that this is a neurological disease.
Got it.
Right. So it's part of the making the disease real. It's not really psychological quite for Charcot, even though it has a psychological component. It is ultimately biologically grounded. So it's beyond the person's control.
Thanks. I think I'm gonna end this with one more question to Ellen, which is asking you to project far beyond your paper. But I'm just curious when mathematicians became dweebs. I found this paper fascinating for a number of reasons, but one of the most interesting was that, as Daniela, your father's also a physicist. I have a family of mathematicians, and no one has ever called them a group of macho men. So.
Yeah, so interesting question. I referenced Amir Alexander, who's written about types of mathematics and kind of images of mathematicians, and he has sort of posited that the rise of computing and its connections to mathematics kind of were. In some cases, people started to marshal that nerdiness and dweebiness. So people who have written about masculinity and computing have talked about how, like, being a pale, skinny, nerdy person who never leaves the computer lab and
indoor kids
and doesn't know how to talk to women, and that kind of image starts to really become tied to mathematics and computing around mid-century, which, is they kind of talk about I'm trying to think of the phrase he uses, but the kind of, wears sandals in his unkept form of a new kind of masculinity, right? That's this very different version. So I would say around mid-century, and it's also something, that I'm interested in looking at a little further as things change. After World War II, there's also kind of a split where the applied mathematics community kind of develops out of its own because it had been so sort of sidelined throughout the early 20th century that there are sort of two very different professional communities between applied mathematicians who are thought of as sort of businessman scientist types. That is a very different kind of, I'm going to wear a suit and I might be in the lobby of a building, masculinity, and then versus the continuing to do this sort of ivory tower abstract mathematics that is very different. And then probably computing looks a little, so gets a little complicated. I would say mid-century, we might start to see that a little bit more, but yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks. And Daniela, you had if any of you have questions for each other before we go, you should have that opportunity as well. So Daniela, I know you did.
So I have a question for Nicole. I was sort of wondering, I've seen that there's a big debate in the 19th century about whether photography is art or if it's just a technical reproduction. And I wonder if that became also connected to the discussion because art tends to be presented as feminine and technology is masculine, whether this debate as to whether photography was art or not art.
I like your question. Actually, when I say this about the United States, I'd certainly say it about France and the UK, which was that while art might be feminine, genius is masculine.
Yes.
So, right. So France and Britain, they have their national or royal academies of art. So it's a bastion of masculine control and power. And photographers, even if they kind of are on the bottom rung, they want to be on that rung. And, they personally feel so strongly about photography that they think it's the equal of painting. And they battle the whole century to try to convince people that it is. And they fail to do that. And, that the battle is only won maybe in the 1930s when museums start to get departments of photography and collect photographs, right? So that's how they played it. I think it was Ellen who was talking about calculations and that kind of becoming feminine in a way, or we think about the period when computers were women, right? And the kind of the same in photography, the kind of same sort of repetitive, supposedly unskilled tasks, definitely lower paid tasks were given to women, while the operator, was often the man working in the dark room to shape the prints, was all of those positions where you could be promoted that had responsibility and the chance for good pay were reserved for men.
This also raises to me the question, sometimes women were put in these lower paying jobs with the excuse that they didn't need to make a living.
Absolutely. Yeah, they were supplemental wage earners, except that, as we know now, they weren't.
But yes, that was still...
Women were often heads of household, and there were many millions of women who lived alone, trying to do the best they could. And that's why many thousands of women in the 19th century turned to photography, because you didn't need the academies say-so. You didn't need a diploma, so you could, if you had a little capital and a friend who could teach, you could even your father's subscription to the journals, right? You could teach yourself and have your own business. And even you could base that business at home. So, in theory, it was a good profession for unmarried and even some married women.
Can I sorry, real quickly, I was wondering too, Nicole, in your presentation about photography wives, it seems like the need to have this sort of assistant and the machine, that there might have been some duos, and whether that played out similarly to other sciences where it was kind of an assistant role, but actually was doing a lot of the production, if that was common or not. Or
did you find that in mathematics?
There are quite a few mathematical couples, but more more, they met in grad school and they both pursue mathematics. His career, there was a lot of anti-nepotism issues that would make it so that often the man's career meant he had a job and the woman would not be hired in the same place.
Right.
But I would imagine maybe in some cases it was an assistant role. Actually, the editor of the monthly would talk about his wife doing all the proofreading and all of the kind of addressing. But photography seems like an assistant, and potentially in the form of a wife who then might be also going to professional meetings or not. A lot of them were on the rolls of those meetings.
All of that is true. And as a matter of fact, Ellen, like in my lifetime, I think I'm a little older than you, but I remember hearing stories of, from male colleagues whose wives typed their dissertations, right? So that was happening. But yes, you definitely had duos. In some cases, competent women taught their husbands the dark art of photography. Sometimes women, widows, continued the studio after a husband's death. Women often became proprietors when something went wrong in the marriage, either illness, disability, death, separation, divorce, all of that could happen. And a woman would either establish a photographic studio of her own or take over her husband's. All over the country, and in Britain as well, and in France, well, I would say.
That's really interesting.
I think
there's definitely a lot of uncredited women's work in a lot of areas of science. I mean, I also work on the Durkheim and the Année sociologique, and his wife regularly read proof and did various other tasks for the journal, which was a lot of work, and this was completely uncredited.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm kind of fascinated by Albert Einstein's first wife.
Yes.
Who was maybe a mathematician or
she was a mathematician, yes.
Yeah, who we never hear about, because she was the first wife. But yeah, it's certainly true. And I have a chapter in my book called, what is it called? Well, this one was sort of building the republic, but there's, establishing paternity, so establishing the paternity of photography. So there were no mothers, there were only fathers. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
I guess we should probably wrap it up. Thank you guys. This has been great. The discussion, the papers, the presentations, all just excellent. And although a lot of them had dropped off, we did have a number of people message me when they had to leave saying they were very sorry, but that this had been terrific and they really enjoyed the papers. And thank you for taking the time to present in spite of the AHA online mess and are not being on the formal schedule. So thank you all so much for your papers. And thank you, Nicole, for doing the legwork. Oh, we have one question, it looks like, from Theo Neuendorfer.
I think he may just be applauding.
Oh, I can't tell.
I was just applauding.
Okay. Thank you.
I was like, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Theo.
Dr. Neuendorfer, how do you pronounce your first name?
Theo.
Oh, yeah, this was a lot of fun. By the way, we forgot to ask folks if it was okay to record, but I did record. So if anybody wants the recording at any time, just ask me.
Okay, great. That's
terrific. And I'm sure we'll offer it to the AHA if they're interested in having it for their records. I guess we can reach out to them for that.
Yes, okay. I also wanted to thank Nicole for really pushing us to actually do this.
Setting up the Zoom.
The energy kind of was a little low sometimes, and our COVID isolation. So
and congratulations, the book sounds really interesting. I'm glad that we got to.
I'm pretty happy with it, and I see it's gonna provide a lot of discussion for me for at least a year. So that's a good thing.
It has a preview on Google Books, so you've made it.
Yes. So I'm going to look forward to seeing your work, everybody here. and it was just such interesting connections were made. And it was a pleasure.
For me as well. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
you all
Thank you
again.
for attending, Teo and Barbara, and for hanging on until the end with us. And everyone have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Everybody.